we've got this published and ready, and it will be exported for people to view at your leisure. The first thing I suppose to say is that timing is going to be against us. We've got 2 hours to explore this issue, so I really want to make the most of this this commodity of time, but that might mean that I will, I'm afraid, be a bit strict on timings of speakers and things like that. So I apologise in advance if that comes across as a bit rude, a bit uncomfortable. I'll try to do it as welcoming as possible, but timing will be against us. So I'll try to do that as much as is required. Can I also please ask the audience to try to remember to keep your microphones muted throughout. That really helps with concentration and reduces any interference for everybody. Now, in terms of the running order and the arrangements, here's how we'll organise it. The first stage, the first half, I'm going to ask each keynote speaker to present their thoughts on the couple of crucial areas of humanitarianism. And they will each speak for between 10 to 15 minutes. And I may well offer a further question to perhaps expand or develop certain points, but the key will be to listen to our keynote speakers. Unfortunately, there won't be an opportunity at this point to ask those 2 people the questions. But I will talk you a little bit at that point about any opportunities. If people have got questions, we will be able to send them to these speakers at a future date so you can get an answer. Then at about 11:45, we'll move to the second stage of the webinar. And in that second stage, we've got a panel discussion where we'll hear from 3 key practitioners who will provide thoughts on the crucial question of the kind of the direction of the global humanitarian system from their own perspectives. I shall then open up the floor for 30 minutes for you, the audience, to ask questions to the panel. And I'd like to do that by using the chat function in Zoom. So please feel free to draft or prepare any questions as we go along. And then after our 3 panel speakers have finished, I'll invite you to post the questions on the chat facility, if that's okay. And then we'll work through those for that half an hour. I'll then aim to summarize and wind up that stage of our webinar for about 12:30, where we'll then pull together some of the main points that we've heard before we close at just before 1, before 1300 hours. I hope that makes sense. I'm going to just pause a second and check with any colleagues if I've forgotten anything. Janica or Claudia, the people that are helping me out with this.
No, that's brilliant.
Okay. So now I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker, who's going to welcome formally us all to this event. My colleague here at the Department of Health Sciences at York and the program leaders for one of the program leaders for the MSc in Humanitarian Affairs, Dr. Jo Rose. Jo, over to you.
Thank you, Jerome. On behalf of the MSc in International Humanitarian Affairs in the Department of Health Sciences at the University of York, we thank you all for attending this global event. Over recent history, the humanitarian sector has changed drastically due to various global contexts, including new emerging humanitarian actors and then the COVID-19 pandemic. The aim of this webinar is to examine the global humanitarian system in a rapidly changing world. We have scholars, policymakers, and practitioners, and as such, this webinar invites you all to engage in a constructive dialogue where we understand the past, examine the present, and establish a vision for the future. Established in 2013 as an online and distance learning postgraduate program, the MSc in International Humanitarian Affairs aimed to provide higher education to frontline humanitarian workers and newcomers to the field. We attempt to facilitate compassionate, caring, humble humanitarian workers, policymakers, and academics. The teaching team of this MSc are conducting research and practical interventions in various disaster and conflict-affected countries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, some of us have been brought in to collaborate with various health providers in Europe and North America. If you've previously collaborated with us, you will know our global systems inputs advocates the importance of bringing the crisis-affected populations to the centre of policy and practice. Based on our experiences, we encourage our students to be critical in their thinking and evaluative in their actions. Our graduates are making a difference in the United Nations and various humanitarian organisations, governments and academia in the global north and south. And we are very proud of our students and our graduates. We would like to thank all contributors to this event. A very special thanks to Jane Milsom, Project Coordinator of our department, and we appreciate Dr. Jerome Wright for chairing this event. Our colleagues in the Department of Health Sciences are supportive and collaborative, which is a real privilege. So thank you for all believing in the MSc in International Humanitarian Affairs. We sincerely thank the keynote speakers of this webinar. Sri Dr Jemilah Mahmood, Professor and Director of the Sunway Centre for Planetary Health in Malaysia, and former Chief of the World Humanitarian Secretariat at the United Nations. Dr. Mahmood is also the founder of Mercy Malaysia, an international medical humanitarian organisation. And Mr. K A M Morshed, Senior Director, Advocacy for Social Change, Migration, Partnership Strengthening Unit, Social Innovation Lab and Technology, BRAC, Bangladesh. Mr. Morshed, one of the first responders to the latest Rohingya crisis of Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, regularly represents BRAC in various committees related to the refugee crisis. It's important to note that BRAC is the largest non-governmental development organisation in the world in terms of the number of employees. It's an honour to have you both delivering keynote speeches for us today. We are grateful for our panellists, Dr. Sarah Elithi, an Egyptian humanitarian practitioner working in the Middle East over the past 10 years, and Sarah is also a graduate of the MSc in International Humanitarian Affairs of the 2017 cohort. Dr. Tamam Aloudat, Managing Director of the Global Health Centre Graduate Institute Geneva. He's a Syrian physician and humanitarian worker with 20 years of experience working with the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement and Médecins Sans Frontières, working in conflicts, disasters, forced displacement and disease outbreaks, both in projects and in the headquarters. Ms. Sigwaya Yuba, National Expert Advisor, Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue, Nigeria. She has vast experience in health, peace, livelihood and democracy, governance and policy strengthening, and she's pursuing a doctorate in development communication at the Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria, Nigeria. Thank you for you all agreeing to share your experiences and knowledge with us today. This webinar brings a true collection of experiences and perspectives from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. In an era of debates on decolonisation, we are really proud to present this webinar with you today, and we invite you all to actively engage with us with this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo. Thank you for introducing us so warmly, and also for prefacing what are going to be a really fascinating webinar and series of speakers. So thank you for that. I don't think I want to take any more time other than to welcome our first speaker, Sri Dr Jemilah Mahmood, whose extensive contribution to the global humanitarian field is well known. Over to you, Dr. Jemilah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and a very sincere thank you to the University of York for asking me to share some thoughts with you today. So I've been given about 15 minutes to talk about a very broad set of issues. So rather than try to boil the ocean, I'm going to focus on 3 points, which I hope will bring some new perspectives to what I fear is becoming a rather tired discussion. When I heard about Grand Bargain 2.0, I have to admit some dismay. The endless debate about localization seems to be caught up in the conference rooms of the Palais des Nations, the webinars of the global clusters, and the corridors of donor nation ministries, and very disconnected from the lived realities of people on the sharp end. I'll warn you now that I don't have answers to how that gets unpicked, but I do have the sense that we are running out of time and that the so-called international humanitarian system increasingly runs the risk of ever greater irrelevance. So let me start by talking about challenges in my own country, Malaysia. We experienced huge floods at the end of December, an event of a magnitude never seen in decades. It claimed so many lives and destroyed countless homes. People were on their rooftops, stranded quite literally for several days, waiting for help. That the event was not better anticipated is a finding which our government has courageously accepted. However, hope was also spun in a different way, where the concept of Kita Jaga Kita as a hashtag, we take care of us, we saw communities come together regardless of race, creed, and background. People provided help in many ways, whether rescuing people, spreading awareness about people's basic needs across social media platforms, or joining even in the cleanup efforts. So my first point is that this was localization at its best and most real. First responders are friends, neighbors, and now increasingly those who are able to connect digitally with disaster-affected people, supported by authorities and professional emergency responders. The global humanitarian system was nowhere to be seen. It wasn't needed, and so could devote its energies to where they are most needed. Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Myanmar, for example. Still focused on Malaysia, my second point is that things work better when we put organizational identities and positioning on temporary hold. So this is what we did with the Greater Klang Valley COVID-19 Task Force last year, which was focused on dealing with COVID-19 in the capital, Kuala Lumpur, and its immediate urban environs, the epicenter of the crisis that we experienced in mid-2021 with the Delta wave. The task force was decentralized, and we were delegated the mandate to make quick decisions on behalf of the health ministry, to coordinate and mobilize resources to prevent collapse of the healthcare system. We created a playbook that guided policymakers and operational teams at the state or district levels on ways to organize a systematic pandemic response. Everyone involved worked collaboratively across all sectors, whether they were public, private, civil society organizations. We leveraged the skills, capacities, and capabilities of specific organizations. For example, we mobilized non-medical volunteers from the general public, civil society organizations, such as the Red Crescent Society, the private sector, and included local community-based focal points, such as religious leaders and community heads to promote public health measures, including to build confidence in the vaccine rollout program. We use mosques, churches, temples as vaccination centers, which further help build community trust in the vaccine. We work with religious leaders to provide information in sermons as part of the ground level effort to quell people's fears about the virus and to explain the national efforts to vaccinate. We encourage places of worship to lead by example and help to counteract vaccine hesitancy or fake news about vaccines. What I'm most proud of is we drove the hard message to government that everyone needs to be protected and vaccinated, including migrants and refugees. In summary, we had organizations break out of their silos and work together with a clear and unifying message. It's either this or we remain in a state of emergency for the foreseeable future. We even established a civil society NGO platform called Match, so donors could have some idea what was going on at ground level, right down to postcode level, and funds could also be directed to organizations. As Omicron surges, the task force is again in place for coordination, rapid decision-making, and mobilizing partners. My third point, and if you take nothing else away from what I'm saying today, then please take this. We, and here I mean we humanitarians, need to work with and not against nature. This is the ethos of a new articulation of the relationship between people and planet, planetary health, a way of looking at the world that our newly established center that I head at Sunway University in Malaysia is championing. Planetary health encompasses a much more holistic approach to the way we live and acknowledges that our health in the broader sense and the health of our planet are inextricably linked with one another. The evidence is right in front of our eyes. COVID-19 has generated a great deal of human suffering in the last 2 years. Its cause is zoonosis, transmission of a virus from animals to humans, caused by ever-increasing encroachment of and proximity to the animal world. The Interagency Standing Committee issued guidelines on localization and COVID-19, but the guidance didn't really say anything new, just that efforts to work with and resource local organizations already enshrined in the 2016 Grand Bargain need to be intensified. It didn't stress the link between damage to the planet and the occurrence of the disease. Meanwhile, the endless debates about localization, accountability, cash, and gender-based violence continued in the humanitarian headquarters in the global north. No doubt, all of these issues remain important, but my sense is that the humanitarian system is stuck in a closed loop that is harder to unpick even than that occupied by politicians who were engaged in the latest COP negotiations in Glasgow. At least there, the global spotlight shone hard on them, and there was a recognition that to walk away with absolutely no progress would be simply unacceptable. But the clock is ticking with the same urgency for humanitarian action as it is for climate change, because the two are so closely linked. Ultimately, the suffering to be born from the confluence of planetary health crises that we will experience in the coming decades will hit the most vulnerable first, and the response to their needs will need to be multi-agency, with the global humanitarian system playing its role. What irks me is that we have the tools to work differently and better. Ask the medical profession and the tech giants. We have put the money there, but used it carelessly and wastefully. We have public support. What we lack is the collective will based on a system that demands rather than simply talks about accountability. We squabble over market share for cash programming, argue about the limits to coordinated action lest our principles be compromised. Capacity build local organizations in our image rather than let them lead us in ways that promote the dignity and resilience of the people they aim to help. So I'm sorry to say that when it comes to opportunities in the localization and future of global humanitarian affairs, I don't have much new to suggest, other than it's time to implement in the real world what has been agreed in the outcome of the World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain commitments. If there's one thing I would suggest is that we need a global humanitarian risk register, which aggregates planetary health risks from a humanitarian perspective and provides anticipatory early warning for all types of disasters and conflict, which is linked to a massive shakeup in how funds are allocated and how they flow. Without it, the system remains reactive and slow, as we have seen with COVID-19. WHO was aware that a pandemic similar to COVID-19 was likely, but it was viewed as just a health concern, and risk-based alarm bells didn't go off to tell us that this pandemic would be much more than just a health crisis, and that it has its roots in our lack of focus on planetary health and its humanitarian impact. Nowhere is this more important than in the hard-to-reach humanitarian crisis that we face. Myanmar is the starkest example in the region of the world that I call home. The suffering there has been massively magnified by the fact that the junta launched their takeover in the midst of the pandemic. Some might argue that they weaponized COVID-19. Whether that is the case or not, the impact of conflict on health of people and planet is very clear. Planetary health is about people and planet existing in harmony. So focusing on the peace building and conflict resolution aspects of humanitarian action and seeing the so-called peace, development, humanitarian nexus from a planetary health perspective is where, in my view, we need to steer the discourse. Of course, this isn't easy. The big, messy politics that surround all of these crises have shown time and time again that humanitarian action is like a sticking plaster for political inaction. But this is a paradigm we can and must shift. Changing the way in which we approach this challenge and using planetary health as an entry point may help to shift entrenched positions. So let me close with an apology. I am sorry that I cannot be more constructive. I'm sorry that I don't have very much new to say. Most of all, I am sorry that the global humanitarian system is so badly stuck. I believe we need a reset, and that a planetary health approach combined with implementing what has been agreed is how we can best move forward. I fear that my beliefs are poorly aligned with those of the people and organizations that currently govern international humanitarian action. But I'm not giving up. Surely by now, we all need to agree to press that reset button. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for, I guess, an absolutely wide-ranging and thought-provoking discussion about the current situation and state of humanitarian actions. I think, can I say, I'm not sorry to have listened to all of that and to have heard that, so thank you for presenting that. It will be impossible for me to summarize that, but I think what you've introduced us to here through the planetary health lens is a different way of approaching and thinking about the global challenges that we have, from climate change, as you said, and crisis, to all the humanitarian crises and difficulties we experience. But you're also introducing a sense of urgency that we're running out of time, not just in terms of climate, but in terms of the organization, the way that we organize things. And you're asking some key questions about how to make the current humanitarian system relevant to addressing the needs of both local communities and the interactions with different countries, different nations, different peoples. And I think the examples that you've given of local ways of working have also been really instructive, and I'm sure resonate amongst the audience here. I'd like now to just focus a little bit on something which Dr. Jemilah has talked about, but will be taken on a bit further from our second keynote speaker, Mr. K A M Morshed, in terms of thinking about how the South-to-South solidarity with humanitarian responses and how we could consider how that can impact. So thank you, Dr. Jemilah. As Joe, my colleague Joe, mentioned earlier on, Mr. K A M Morshed is going to talk. He's an expert on policy and practice in international development and actually aid effectiveness from BRAC, and he is going to talk to us, as I said, about South-to-South solidarity, which will develop some of the points that have already been highlighted. Solidarity of how the South works with South, and give the case of BRAC as an example of the way forward. I really look forward and welcome to hearing from Mr. Morshed. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. First up, let me start by saying I loved what Dr. Jemilah had to say, and kind of consider that is my first part of my keynote, because this is exactly, she reflected exactly the reality that we all are facing. So I'll give you rather a practitioner's view of what BRAC as an organization, which is almost 50 years of existence, we're celebrating 50 years now, largest organization in terms of our human resource, but more importantly, our number of beneficiary or participant and sustainability. So if you look at this presentation, and there is this 50-year logo of BRAC, the celebration logo. We are celebrating BRAC from Bangladesh to the world. I think this is quite a audacious logo. We're basically saying, hey, the world in need, we are here to be and ready to work with you to try solve a problem. So this is the position that we are taking. We are a South-South organization, and we can provide a alternative, if you may, narrative of a solution framework. So if you look at it, I'll basically talk three things. So one is this: what is this other form of humanitarianism? Southern humanitarianism or South-South collaboration. One slide on BRAC's history, and then the BRAC's way. And there I'll just go. We'll not talk about the problem, but we'll talk about how BRAC is dealing with it. So to me, Southern approach is basically, these are the three aspects of it. One is it has to be delivered by Southern, national, local NGOs or CBOs. It needs to be community-based instead of the techno-bureaucratic approach that most Northern solutions framework is designed, that there is somebody who knows best, then the community who comes and teach the community what to do, rather than let the community find out what is best for them, and fully or partially funded by the host government or the Southern governments or affected communities. And in this context, South-South is about a customized accountability framework. So the North-South, this polarization is dissolved in South-South. This is where partnership begins, and the service standards are agreed mutually instead of those CHS standards, these global humanitarian standards and so on, which was created as Kothari, for example, said this is a neo-colonial project because he showed that how this entire humanitarian architecture is based on the Northern ideas of how the rest of the world should be. They talk about think globally, act locally, as if the local people can think and the global people don't have anything to do with acting. So that framework is challenged when it comes to the South-South cooperation. And then there is a more explicit recognition that humanitarianism is also political. The cause of humanitarian crisis is political. The solution also have this political aspect, which is basically challenging this Northern idea of kind of controlling a situation, containing a situation instead of solving it. So these two, I think, is the big issues in when it comes to talk about South-South collaboration and so on. So with this, let me quickly go to a quick slide on how BRAC has come this far and why BRAC is talking about these issues, and what we have learned we'll just present in the next section. So in 1972, BRAC was formed in response to a humanitarian crisis. In 16 December 1971, Bangladesh won independence. 30 million Bangladeshis took refuge in India during this war. So they came back to find that there is nothing left in their original villages. And this is where BRAC was established to help them settle. So it was initially a humanitarian agency, but as the time progresses, BRAC realized that you cannot just do humanitarian action and feel and think that people are they're back on track. You really need a longer term hand-holding, longer term engagement. And from 1974 onward, BRAC moved into the development space. But those humanitarian core was there, and it was tested again and again by Bangladesh's climate related or weather, extreme weather conditions. You know, think about Bangladesh. Dr. Jemilah talked about one incidence of flood. think about this every 3 years is a routine now. And when 15% of Bangladesh goes underwater, we call it normal flood. That's every year, and we don't mind. So this is the type of calamity that this country lives through. And so our humanitarian turned into this, and exactly what Dr. Jemilah was saying, that this is the local people, they contribute with their money, with their labor, and BRAC only provides the platform. And this is what BRAC has learned all these years. In 2016, in response to the third influx of Rohingya refugees to Bangladesh, BRAC tentatively moved into that space and started serving the refugees. And then when in 17, this huge influx, the exodus started, we went in fully, and by 2019, we are the largest responder in Cox's Bazar right now. Of this, around a million Rohingyas are there, and we are serving them. And also in 19, we are also going international with our refugee response. BRAC was international, we are serving in 11 countries, but we also started humanitarian action in Uganda to start with, and we are gradually expanding. So that's BRAC, and we have this experience of mostly development, but this development is shattered, battered by the climate-related humanitarian crisis, and BRAC was regularly responding to this, and that's our learning, if you may. So in this context, let me just put 4 aspects of so-called BRAC way, and this might actually answer some of the concerns, some of the frustration Dr. Jemilah was talking about. First is, we believe in community-led action and solution. We don't think the humanitarian response to a humanitarian crisis is only technical or financial. Humanitarian crisis or poverty or lack of underdevelopment, lack of crisis is often lack of hope and courage. So the least the organization can do is work with the community, give them the courage and the hope and the tools to get them back on feet. And that works wonderfully. And for that, you don't need a northern technical help. You don't need a lot of money. Second is, we also, all our BRAC staff, in most cases, in all response, we try to make sure that we recruit people, hire people from the same community who are affected, because then this staff is not only doing his or her job, actually serving his or her family, neighbors, relatives. And that southern approach works great for us. And then in the refugee context, this is something that interesting happened when in 2017, this influx started coming, and we walked in, we went into the camp. And for example, we established WASH committee, a concept which was foreign to any humanitarian northern approach of, you have a set rule and how that rule tells you how many toilets are needed, where they should be put, and so on and so forth. We instead went into the camps, large camps, and actually divided the people into WASH committees, and actually asked them, find out what is needed, where it needed, who will own it, how much do you need to maintain it. And we funded the community groups to do this work. This was done cheaply, with very good, in a high speed, and the utilization was phenomenal. So BRAC, because of our belief in community-led development, we haven't gone by those standards. We let the people create their standard and go by it. Second aspect of BRAC was, we don't believe that a humanitarian agency can be and should be seen as a provider, as a, this is, then you're actually killing the spirit, the human spirit of the affected community. So from the very first day, we made sure that people, those who are needing support, also should contribute in with whatever they have. If it is money, if it is labor, if it is time, if it is ideas, they should contribute. And right now in BRACs, at least in Bangladesh, 25% of BRACs annual program of around $400 million comes from various local intervention. We call them social enterprise. The money that we earn from there, and these money these services and products are sold to the entire Bangladesh. So we run the second largest dairy farm in Bangladesh, the dairy product company in Bangladesh, the largest producer of maize seeds in Bangladesh. We are the largest lifestyle brand in Bangladesh, where 60,000 local artisans sell their product through. So all these are then plowed back into programs which helps people in need. So this is another example of South-South self-sufficient, sustainable funding, where even if suddenly all the partners, donors stop donating, we should at least continue with 30 to 40% of our program easily, or even probably more. And then the BRAC associates, BRAC also have BRAC USA, BRAC UK, BRAC Netherlands. So these are sister organizations, and they also make sure that BRAC has a flexible financing arrangement. We're not tied to 2-3 international big donor, or few foundations, or few UN agencies. Rather, we made sure that BRAC reach out to a variety of partners, and we have a financing mechanism that doesn't tie our hands to a particular standard or particular ism and so on, and so that people can still do what they need to do. And then we also have almost all Ivy Leagues are partner of BRAC, Ivy League universities. They do vigorous impact assessments, and which really helped us in the long term, making our case and independently making the impact talk about us. Third is we also have developed some very interesting partnership, which is, I spent my previous life in UN, and nowhere, as far as I knew, you had an arrangement like that, where international donor like DFAT, the Australian aid, FCDO, the UK aid, now Global Affairs Canada, they are actually giving almost a budget support to BRAC's development program plan. So we developed the program in consultation with government, with community, with our peer organizations, and so on. And we basically present a 5-year plan to the development partners and say, if it fits, if it works for you, you can buy a result. So you can give us money so that you can say this result was produced with your money. But you remain a close friend of ours. But this is not a projectized agreement. This is not a design that is coming from the capitals. Again, this is an arrangement that we have developed, and I think a lot can be learned from these arrangements and can be replicated. Recently, we have started a climate breach fund for climate refugees with KfW, which is the German Development Bank. Again, there is an interesting arrangement where I said, okay, half of the money BRAC will use for BRAC's programming, but the other half will go to smaller NGOs, local NGOs, to do their programming. So localization, all these grand bargain, 25% and so on and so forth, we simply choose to not look into it and develop our grand bargain, if you may, with KfW. We are now currently working on probably the world's first refugee pool fund managed by a local NGO. There is this hegemony of northern philosophy when it comes to some of the pool funds. You have either the UN or NRCs and others of the world who manages this fund, but we're saying no. BRAC has the capacity. We will manage the fund. We will ensure that a Bangladeshi NGO gets the capacity it needs. And if it means that BRAC will not get a penny out of this pool fund, so be it. So we are developing another level of South-South collaboration, where BRAC is collaborating with other NGOs in the in country who simply is not compliant to the Western standard with the CHS. They are not, and they're not big enough to buy those licenses. But BRAC is going to kind of support them and vouch for them, their quality and so on. So this is another type of southern thing that we're doing. And finally, we always believed in working as in collaboration with larger NGO sector. So, and this is what we're doing. You know, we're partnering, for example, disaster management, all the disaster management work that we have done. So always done through CBOs, community-based organizations of the locality, so that again, they are close to this problem and they know the solution better. COVID-19, the same thing that we have done. We have done COVID-19 identification, we have the vaccine awareness, testing, now vaccination for government, but through smaller NGOs who are local, who has the trust and who the people can kind of connect to. That, okay, this person is doing the vaccination, I know this person personally, so this must be a good thing. And then in Cox's Bazar also, in the Rohingya refugee crisis, we are the only agency who has a large number of partners, local partners, who may not have the requirement, prerequisite for getting a funding directly from different donors. So we are taking the risk, we're managing the risk, but delivering, but the service is delivered by them.
Mr. Morshed, sorry, just a couple of minutes to wrap up. This is
and that's the last slide I had.
Oh, the secret of comedy is timing, isn't it? Thank you so much, Mr. Morshed. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for, I guess, sharing with us this model, the BRAC model, the BRAC way of working, which is around local ownership, and it's around wider than simply aid. It's about local social enterprise and developing sustainable funding, all aspects of it. I'm intrigued by your important point that the problems are political, and so therefore the solutions are political. And I think you've given us plenty of nourishment to this idea about what tools there would be of hope and courage to kind of to rather than, as you say, contain problems, actually begin to work with communities to solve problems and to and you've also introduced us, because I was intrigued about this issue around how do you manage when often it's a North American or a North dominated system of humanitarian pressures, and you're describing collaborations as equal partners and with expertise, which adds a different type of dynamic, I think, to the humanitarian dialogue. So that's absolutely fascinating, and thank you so much for sharing that with us. So thank you both. I'm now going to hopefully from those stimulating talks build now into the second stage of our event. Just to remind people that actually to say that if you have any questions or ideas that you would like to put forward to Mr. Morshed or to Dr. Jemilah earlier on, then please email those to the organizers of, to Janica or organizers of the event, so that we can then, we've agreed to put those to our speakers, because otherwise you won't have much of a chance to get questions and answers with this group. So so if you would like to do that, then please do so, and we will kind of pass those on. So thank you again to those speakers. I'm now going to introduce the panel discussion, and just as a reminder to you, as we're beginning to listen to our speakers, if you wanted to draft or think about some of the questions that you'd like to pose to them for the panel discussion at the end of the presentations, then please think about those now, and I will then invite you to post them once the speakers have been in the chat once the speakers have finished. So without further ado, as they say, I'd like to introduce us to our first speaker on the panel. And the panel's challenge is to think about what future do we see in the global humanitarian system. So interested in the perspectives of three speakers from different points of the lens of humanitarian work. Our first speaker, Dr. Sarah Eliti, is actually an alumni from the University of York Masters in Humanitarian Affairs. And she's a humanitarian practitioner from the Middle East. And I very much look forward to hearing the presentation. Sarah, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerome. Hello, everyone. It's a great honor to be with you today. And it's a special honor, particularly being as a graduate of the MSc in International Humanitarian Affairs. So as a response to your question, I think that the system needs to be changed to address the increasing humanitarian crisis and the change of its nature as well. So the humanitarian landscape appears more and more distorted when the same countries that fuel conflict are exactly those that fund and support many humanitarian actors. For this, we need to continue to critically address this particular dissonance and to help to see the facts for what they really are. The nature of the modern war, the war by proxy, the lucrative fuel and arms deals do not come as a coincidence. And sadly, it's impacting the nature of what we do as humanitarians, and it's complicating the context where we try hard to provide principled humanitarian action and to ensure access to affected populations. So similar to medical doctors who may treat symptoms only without addressing the diseases causing it, we're only responding to emergencies, the symptoms of conflict, but we do not have a key role in resolving the root causes. The only way that suffering is alleviated, lives are saved, and dignity is restored is by halting crises from happening. To some extent, we have started to have some progress in addressing this path when it comes to climate change by disaster risk reduction and climate change mitigation efforts, yet we're still very far when it comes to armed conflict. The solution remains political. We live in a reality whereby the number of active conflicts has significantly increased, and the average duration of these conflicts has more than tripled since 2005. The humanitarian system has been trying to adapt, but both in terms of funding, resources, and improving quality and accountability ever since. This is not to say that the humanitarian system does not matter. On the contrary, we need to find ways and approaches to improve the system and to ensure that it's not being used for cosmetic purposes. Humanitarian aid should never be used as a compensation for increasing the intensity of conflict and conducting atrocities. A silver lining I think we had today from the discussion would be that we're starting to see certain changes to the global humanitarian system. For example, Mercy Malaysia and BRAC are two examples that there is a strong South-South cooperation to assist the affected population. Even countries such as Cuba, Turkey, and many other non-Western countries are providing effective and relevant humanitarian assistance. On a different note, and as I cannot address all the issues that I would love to discuss in relation to vulnerable communities and humanitarian action in this event, I would like to highlight one topic, which is the need for the humanitarian system to acknowledge the shortcomings in response to IDP needs. The absence of a specialized mandated organization or an entity, and the vagueness of what protection means when it comes to IDPs needs it to be addressed. We should also acknowledge the complexity of internal displacement and the different variables that complicate the nature of the action of the humanitarian system in that regard. Renewed efforts are needed more and more to prevent the reversal of the progress that we have had over the past decades with regards to IDPs response, and to ensure that IDPs remain on the international agenda and to address the gaps which continue to limit protection, assistance, and solutions for the most vulnerable. This can only begin by allowing the affected population to have ownership of their solutions and to ensure that the voices of the affected population are truly in the center of policy and practice. Although the humanitarian family has worked hard in order to ensure the mainstreaming of core humanitarian standards, that we have accountability to affected population guidance, in the field, we're still observing the dissociation between policy and practice. The current measures in place vary depending on the context, the field actors, and the funding. Then it becomes crucial to understand that ensuring the integration of communities does come actively, and to consciously ensure through a systematic approach that the most vulnerable people have their voices heard, and to ensure that their priorities are reflected directly in programming and policy, and to have tailored approaches that needs to be in place, such as the examples, for instance, today that's mentioned by BRAC. I think I would have to share a little bit of pessimism that I did not come up with probably exceptional positive solutions as Dr. Jemilah, but I think that diagnosing our challenges and the barriers that we have is the first step in order to be able to solve it. Thank you very much, and over to you, Jerome.
Thank you, Sarah. Fantastic. Some ideas there, some optimism, some pessimism there, but also a call for us to really understand the problem, to diagnose, to understand what's happening, and to not forget forgotten people, such as internally displaced people, as one example of that. Lovely, thank you. I'm going to pass over directly now to our second speaker on the panel. He's Dr. Tamam Alaudat, who is Managing Director of Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And he's a physician from Syria, and very much look forward to, again, Tamam's ideas on how he sees the future of the global humanitarian system. Over to you, Tamam. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I doubt that I'm very thankful for having been put after such brilliant speakers, but I will give it a shot. The last summer, 7 professors in the University of Auckland issued a letter, a public letter, that has complained about the request to include Mataranga Maori, which is the Maori knowledge system, the indigenous knowledge system of New Zealand, in the Maori curriculum in addition to Western science. Please get me, they didn't desire canceling science. They didn't want to impose their knowledge on others. They asked to have the right to teach their kids their traditional knowledge in their curriculum. 7 prominent professors, outraged, put a public letter of complaint about how this quasi-science can be accepted or even proposed. They compared it to the teaching of creationism, that controversy in the US a lot, as an equivalent to science. And I sat and watched an 85 years old psychologist, one of the signatories, since then he has passed away, saying, you know, that to a Maori TV presenter, this is not science. You can't call it science. This is proto-science. When she asked him about having navigated the ocean with Maori knowledge, he said, this is proto-science. It was science once, but it isn't anymore. So, putting aside the irony of, if you ask a theoretical physicist about psychology, I doubt that they would call it science, but that's beside the point. It is about positionality. It is about what we accept as knowledge, what we accept as legitimate view of the world. And one of the problems that has become emphasized and amplified in the past years is that humanitarianism, which was a rebellious idea one day, rejected war, rejected the unnecessary suffering, and found ways to impose limits even on the most barbaric and brutal things, is now part of the system. that system that is bent on profit at any cost, bent on protectionism of the inner circles at the expense of the outer circles, should have been the main target of humanitarians. Because if we are out to, as our slogans say, save lives, restore dignities, then that's what we should do. Bardot, who is a philosopher, a French philosopher in the early 90s, talked about healthcare being the left arm of the state. He said the judiciary, the police, the force that can be exerted is the right hand, it's the violence. Healthcare and education are the left hand that you use so you wouldn't have to use the right hand. And it has been argued by several researchers and scholars that humanitarianism has become, in its current patriarchal imposing form, a left arm of a world order that isn't really trying to care. Now, there's a distinction here that needs to be done and is essential because it makes a difference to what gets done. Humanitarians are people who have dedicated their lives to serving people in distress. The sad part is that we have, all of us, been at one point or the other co-opted into a system that isn't really doing that. This is obvious in COVID-19. All the talk about solidarity, about alterity, about how good the world is, collapses the moment there's a competition over vaccines. There's fear of the others. There's the diseased other. The humanitarianism and war get conflated because we use war metaphors to describe humanitarianism. We're fighting disease, we're fighting conflict, and we use health and humanitarian vocabulary to describe our protectionism. We're preventing parasites coming from the outside. We alienate, we refuse, we reject. So thanks for speakers before me for dropping the pretense of an apolitical system of humanitarianism. Thank you for acknowledging that it is broken. And thank you for saying that there is a reset to be done. Now, one of the elements that this gets examined is absolutely what Professor Jemilah said on planetary health. And this comes, there's no surprise that this center, like the Sunway Center, comes from Malaysia, not from Europe, because it is within the DNA of indigenous people, of people who have been, entitled and caring for their environments and territories for centuries, to know about this connection between people, non-human animals, and the environment and the planet and the culture. And that is absolutely promising. What I would argue here, in addition, is that this can only be coalesced around if we go ahead and acknowledge that we cannot fight, we cannot resist the problems that have inflicted our discipline without realizing their origins. And a lot of that comes from a heritage of colonialism that still resides in the system, as it does in most of the multilateral system and the global systems. This gets, as colonialism was, this gets co-opted and instrumentalized by a capitalist profit system, and we end up serving exactly what hurts people. Sarah said that, and we end up being an instrument of justifying the continuing domination. The good thing, that if not good, I am not very good at optimism, and Professor Jemilah called me once in a panel the angry MSF guy, but that rightly so. The recognition of coloniality's continuing influence and accepting a positive view of decoloniality, which is not about eliminating anything or removing anything. It is about recognizing different ways of knowing and living and existing in the world. If we are going to learn something, let's learn from indigenous populations how they kept their environments livable and diverse for centuries, how health was, how people thrived despite the non-existence or beside Western medicine. a humanitarianism that does that, that not only aims at saving lives and then throwing people into the jaws of the monster again, but allows them conditions in which livability is possible, would be a huge step. And if that is within a planetary health context, then we would be more than lucky. Thank you very much.
Tamam, thank you very much for that thought-provoking discussion there, talk. Thanks for reminding us, I think, about the kind of its importance of positioning humanitarianism in the global system, which includes neo-colonial system as well, and also for linking us to things like epistemic injustice and the kind of how do we talk about ownership if we reject or we exclude certain ways of knowing. So thank you so much for talking about the recent past and the past to help inform where we are today. Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to our final speaker from the panel. That's Zigwai Ayuba. I'm really pleased to introduce her. She's an expert advisor at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue from Nigeria, and she too is going to give us a perspective of how she sees the global humanitarian system, the future of the global humanitarian system. Over to you, Zigwai. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerome. It's nice to be here, and I like what other speakers have really discussed. And it's interesting to know that thoughts are aligned. And, you know, I will be speaking basically trying to look at the context in which I live and work in, especially in Africa. You know, it's quite tricky that there's certain differences based on what has been shared compared to what we experience over here in Africa. So, however, you'll be hearing some context that I'll be bringing to the table so that we understand clearly the direction in which this conversation is taken. So quickly, I would like to say that my own perspective about the humanitarian system is that it's kind of overstretched. There's a lot of need, and this is primarily because a lot of people have really stretched the system and created human needs, you know, rather than we're not dealing too much with the environmental factor or the natural factor, but we're dealing primarily with some needs that have been created by human beings. And it simply shows that going forward, we're going to be having consistently the desire for more humanitarian support. The causes of most of this humanitarian crisis are man-made, and if you come to where we are in Africa, you find out that it's not far-fetched from religion, it's not far-fetched from ethnicity, it's not far-fetched from land, it's not far-fetched from terrorism, you know, and a lot of other criminal behaviors that lead to humanitarian crisis. So you will find out that also these are things that people will have to live with day in, day out. And while the populace are battling with such big challenges that are rearing their heads in the face every day, you find out that the political elites are strategically focusing on some of the resources that they would actually take for themselves. So which further exacerbates what is going on the ground in terms of humanitarian crisis. So you find out that it is important for us to ensure that as humanitarian workers, as people that are passionate about what is going on, we need to make impacts deliberately by ensuring that we create room for people who are the victims of humanitarian crisis to have an opportunity to participate in certain decisions that will be taken about humanitarian crisis. And when they participate, naturally, you find out that in the process, we will learn from them and they would also learn from us. And collectively, we will take action. And in taking those actions, you find out that you would find that they are able to sustain results. They're able to sustain whatever effort is being put in place, and the action would linger for a longer time. And in the course of work also, I have found out that dialogue and mediation, this is one very strong tool that you can use in untangling a lot of issues that are leading to humanitarian crisis. However, there's a great need for more deliberate efforts to forestall such crises by government. You know, if the government of the day in Africa are willing to take the necessary steps, you know, we're going to be nipping some of this crisis in the bud, because some of them are really, really unnecessary. And you would find out that just a simple effort would help in reducing all of this kind of crisis. So then for me, the next question is, so what then is the future of humanitarian crisis, or of humanitarian systems, sorry. So you will find out that in the nearest future, I foresee that we're going to be having pockets of smaller humanitarian crisis caused by little issues. We're not going to have this very large, like a war or something that is causing this crisis, but we will have smaller pockets emanating because resources are not being given to certain people, or there's a negligence in terms of government system, or in terms of policies that have been drafted that are anti-people. So we will be dealing with some of those things, and there will be an upsurge of smaller conflicts in that regard. So obviously international supports are rapidly dwindling. You will recall that FCDO had to pull out its funds in many things that it was supporting, and it is one of the biggest humanitarian body that we all know globally. And FCDO has really pulled out resources from Africa. And what then becomes of that? With FCDO and others trying to cut down on the monies that, or on the resources or the support they're sending down for humanitarian issues, you'll find out that some of these humanitarian issues are going to linger longer than they should have ended. And you will also know that, like I said initially, mediation and dialogue over resource management, you know, natural resource management is very, very important, because if you look at all of these issues that are springing the humanitarian crisis we're experiencing, they're tactically tied to natural resource management, the willingness to share and the unwillingness to share. You know, these are things that are really rearing their head day in, day out. And, you know, over here, it's not, we're privileged not to be dealing with natural resources, very large natural resources, like the big floods we get to hear in other places, the tornadoes, the hurricanes, the fires, you know. But beyond that, we also need to really, really work on how we can share natural resources collectively, that I am willing to probably share my field or something that I have with another person that doesn't have. As simple as water, it leads to humanitarian crisis over here. So it is important for us to understand that, and also to see how best we can really manage natural resources collectively. And it is important also to note that sadly, humanitarian workers over here are at the forefront, and they're becoming endangered consistently. So while you're trying to support another person to deal with the issues that they have become victims of, you're also endangered. You know, I'm sure most of us have heard stories of how humanitarian workers, peace workers, have been abducted, and some of them to this day, they have not returned to their families. So it's very important for us to start having conversations. How do we address these things? And one of the solutions I will say at this juncture is that internally, as resources from external humanitarian support begins to dwindle, it is important for us to start looking internally to identify big conglomerates, leaders, those that are championing various strong policies, or they have some very stable businesses. What is their own social give back to the communities or to the countries that they're working in? You know, they need to start looking within to start addressing some of these humanitarian crises, because it is not possible that we would continue to depend on humanitarian support from other places. So collectively, I think as key actors, we need to come to the table and start drawing up plans. We need to have conversations with government and policymakers. Their actions and inactions have ripple effect on the humanitarian conflict or crisis that we're experiencing. And, you know, by and large, it leads to violence. So I would like to say that my points are really hinged on what other speakers have spoken on, and I'd like to draw a pause here so that together we can look at it and see if there are questions, if there are more that we need to really respond to. Let's respond collectively and see how we can find a middle ground or solutions that would linger longer than we have lived on Earth. So thank you so much, and over to you, Jerome.
Thank you, Zigwai. Thank you so much. Yeah, I don't know what the audience felt. I sensed a level of optimism amidst some levels of pessimism within that. You raised some important issues that I think for us to think about, echoing actually some of the Dr. Jemilah and Mr. Morshed and other speakers' notion of local and global, and kind of, we talk about pockets of small crisis. We wouldn't know about those pockets or those issues unless the local community are aware of it and then empowered to try to work with that, which kind of mirrors, echoes what we've heard earlier on, which is really interesting. You also talked a bit about, again, the importance of optimism, of sharing resources and capacity and capability. And that being a role for humanitarian efforts, and that challenge of kind of the dilemma of short and long-term programs as well, and sustainability. And lastly, you highlighted also the theme of humanitarian workers themselves and their own safety and their own conditions and for their own sustainability. And that is an important issue that we must keep in mind as well. So thanks so much for completing our panel of 3 speakers, Zigwai. I'm going to, as I threatened, I'm going to ask you now, if you would like to pose questions for either the panel as a whole or individuals in our panel, any questions that you'd like to pose to them. I'll pause as I look through some of those, and perhaps one of my colleagues would also be able to look through as well if there are any questions coming up. We've got some really positive comments about the presentations, all the presentations so far, and highlighting some of the points that each of the speakers have made. Because it's important to have questions, but it's also helpful and supportive to hear that people are actually keen on having this dialogue. These kind of themes are so important to, as our speakers have said, to talk about, to try to understand the origin, the sources of problems before we, and to think about how we can prevent and respond to issues. So I'm looking through at the moment. While we're waiting, I'm just wondering whether I might start off with a question to the panel, really, and I guess it's talking about the trying to open up such a dialogue and some of the panel have talked about which delegates, which places, which people should be involved in the dialogue. And I'm wondering if any of the panel could enlighten us or talk to us a bit about if you are proposing this a dialogue, who the stakeholders should be in terms of trying to manage things within a country, within a particular state that doesn't necessarily have the capacity or the monies or resources available to attend to it. So what kind of dialogue should take place and who should be involved in that?
Is that question for me, Jerome?
Sorry, for any of the panel, and so thank you. I noticed that Dr. Taman has put his hand up there. Then I'll come to you, Zigwai. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to make a quick distinction. The localization and engagement and dialogue and all that has, and you know, I always say that because it's important. Whatever I criticize, I have done before, and I have nothing but apologies about it. So it's not from a position of righteousness at all. All those have been predicated on the idea that the humanitarians who come from the outside know better for people than those people know themselves. So, and hence it's sort of a graceful gesture to ask people about what they want, but it carried no implications. If it happens to align with what you thought should happen, then you would do it. If it doesn't, then you don't. And here I'm talking about international organizations particularly. When localization started becoming fashionable, that rather than dissolve power to people locally, it has co-opted and often corrupted the possibility of local action by trying to, you know, finding people who are doing well, giving them some resources, and then demanding of them they reporting and engagement and speaking perfect English and not having typos and sending financial reports in complicated Excel sheets and all that, to the extent that whatever well they were doing went away because they were trying to, you know, get overhead so they can hire people who know how to do Excel and write emails in English. And that is, this kind of localization is a corruption. That state, ring-fenced money, earmarked money, only available for stuff that are priority for donors, only available under, you know, technical circumstances that are accepted by donors. All that has corrupted the possibility of local action. When that wasn't done, they were discredited. They were called unhumanitarian. I'll give an example. The white helmets in Syria have saved the lives of more than 120,000 people under aerial bombardment, lost more volunteers than any humanitarian organization in the past period. And if anything, they're not being graced with the label of humanitarianism because they're biased, they're not neutral. So there's a distortion of this localization. So I will make a plea for, because people, the dialogue cannot be initiated by people themselves. They are under a system of oppression that doesn't allow them to speak. This is our problem to start with. So we have big organizations that still have leeway and that still have a say. And one of the ways, instead of going and consulting with people and doing whatever you want, go and tell people, here's my capacities, here's my technical expertise, here are the resources that I can make available for you or seek to make available. Tell me what to do. Rather, what do you think? And then do what they tell you to do. And we need a base from which this works, so it could be argued for, not dismissed as just theoretical, you know, dreaminess, and that is feasible immediately. Thank you.
Thank you, Taman. That's provoking. So it's the type of dialogue that we have and the power involved in that dialogue, which is crucial. Zigwai, can I come to you?
Yes, Jerome. Yes, so thank you. So just quickly to say that having dialogue is really important. And I like what the previous speaker said. who would spearhead the dialogue. You know, it's important for us to identify neutral parties. You know, neutral parties that are able to really push some of these conversations to the table of key actors, so that collectively we start thinking, having this idea that yes, these conversations can happen. Yes, we can find solutions to some of these things, because it's going to linger longer than we're thinking if we do not take these necessary steps at this very stage, because the time is absolutely now to take those steps. Because if we do not take them, then we're going to bequeath a generation that is going to be battling with much more than we're battling right now. And if you know, for me, I think having the dialogue is simply means that we need to identify first and foremost who are the victims, you know, and what were those circumstances that led to them being victims of humanitarian crisis. When we find those circumstances, then how do we nip in the bud some of these occurrences that lead to these happenings? Is it because there's some reluctance from government? Is it because it's a natural issue or a natural phenomenon and we need to take certain actions to reduce these things? You know, if we identify these things strategically, we will be able to go down to the nitty-gritty and ensure that we tie all loose ends and ensure we reduce, if we're dealing with natural humanitarian crisis, it's a lot easier. We know we can't control it. Or we know that by building certain, for instance, drainages, we're able to cut down the level of erosion, for instance, or flood, or, you know, just those basic natural issues that we can't control. However, for the ones we can control, the man-made humanitarian crisis that we often put ourselves, when I say we, I mean we, then, quote and unquote, it is important for us to come to the table and find truthful solutions, solutions that the people can own a process, the solutions that we can encourage people to be more tolerant. Because these are issues that usually the lack of tolerance is another strong trigger for humanitarian crisis. And we need to also find out, why are we having an upsurge of terrorist groups that are causing more humanitarian crisis? Is there anything that they're demanding for and they're not getting? So these are things that if we're able to structure it into mediation and dialogue, we will have some headway. Over. Thank you.
Thank you, Sigurd. So in issues particularly of conflict, then there is something about some working through and trying to understand and to move through that conflict to be able to then address the issues you're saying there. Mr. Morshed, you've also got your hand up. Can I just come to you as part of the panel to answer that same question?
Yeah, thank you. I start where Jiwe just stopped. I think all humanitarian crisis comes out of a conflict. It may not be a war, but conflict around share of resources. And in any conflict, we need to find out who is the victim, real victim, and empowering the real victim should always work in rebalancing the power, because all humanitarianism also imbalance of power. And when it comes to poverty, when it comes to humanitarian crisis, the victims are their victims because they are powerless. And so you need to bring them, make them powerful, get them into the center to do this. But I also like to challenge this idea of ethics and morality here. Ethics won't give anybody convince anybody to give up power. It has to be give and take. It has to be a political process. If power is political, distribution of power is political as well. And there, a humanitarian agency needs to find out the political ways and means to intervene. And then this dialogue can happen. We cannot expect a big international agency suddenly realize, oh, we are exercising too much power and we should reduce. That won't happen. Doesn't matter how many panels happen, how many speeches are made. These are supported by intrinsic strong interest. So that is important for all of us. Thank you.
Cam, you're reminding us again of the context and the political context of all of these decisions and decision making. And I think it comes to you might want to first in the panel to be, well, anyone in the panel to think about this first question from Robin Cross, who's asked us. I think it builds on what we've just been talking about. He's asked, what are the top 3 actions to decolonize the global humanitarian system? That's a big question, but I figure that we're starting to think about that in terms of what type of dialogue or what type of communications, what type of relationships exist. Can I hand it over to you first of all? Any of our panel want to talk on that?
I think Sarah had her hand up.
Sorry, I couldn't see Sarah against you. I've lost Sarah. Is she? Sorry, Sarah, you have. Thank you.
No worries. I'm sorry, I have to return back again to the discussion we have just had, and it's building on what Dr. Tamam has mentioned. It's very easy said than done when we mention community engagement. From the field experience, it becomes more of a checklist that you need to tick. So yes, we have community leaders, we have key informants, we have managed to have community dialogue and discussions, and what we're actually do is that we're creating tyranny. We're manipulating the power play within the community, and it's actually hindering the most vulnerable to reach to what they really need. And we do that, and it's nicely drafted in reports that we have conducted all the accountability measures that are in place. We have done all the feedback that we needed. We've spoke to the community. So even when defining who in the community do you actually talk to, we just put this structure in the beginning. We leave it as it is. And then it creates a lot of abuse to those that are really in need, and they're never voiced. So yes, it might sound and look that we're putting everything in place, but this process needs a very close observation and work and a dialogue and discussion. It's not just something that you put in place and you just leave it and you assume that it's there. So this is something I really needed to say on that particular point. Thank you so much. Over to you, Jerome.
Thank you, Sarah. I mean, those are powerful words in terms of it can create its own tyranny. I think that's a really interesting way of framing that in terms of replicating previous power dynamics in an attempt to resolve them, actually recreating them. Taman, I don't want to interrupt there. Taman, if we can continue on this discussion.
Yes, absolutely. And that goes back to what are the 3 actions? There are infinite actions, like 3s and 5s that do not work here, but there's also one simple one: dissolve power. There's no absolute knowledge or absolute wisdom or absolute. The fact that some organizations are located in rich country, hence can avail resources, doesn't give them authority over people's lives, unaccountable and without. It's as simple as that. To follow Sarah's argument, absolutely. I think there are a couple of things that get misunderstood in this conversation immediately. One of them is if we acknowledge the coloniality of a global health system or a humanitarian system, then the only solution is to dismantle it. This is false. We have no moral standings in saying tomorrow whoever is getting humanitarian aid should die just because we want to decolonize. This is not the argument. The argument is the recognition of the power imbalance and the addressing of it collectively. It's not the South against the North. It's not, it is a collective dialogue that accepts multiple epistemic angles of our existence. The second one is, it's not idealizing the local at the cost of the global. We're not going to ignore all the varieties of power, the marginalization, the exclusion, the tyrannies that are created. And I can argue that a lot of them are a result of coloniality, but that doesn't matter. They still exist. And we're not going to take power out of the hand of one tyrant to hand it to the other, so they can continue the exact same, exploitation and in the different guise. So the single action is not dissolve power to those who are already powerful locally. It is use the privilege that we have as international organizations to ensure that people are heard, to give this space for everyone. And again, I said, I owe nothing but apologies. I've sat on the ground floor with older men in beards and drank tea with a circle of other men around us, and then a wider circle of women and children who had no voice. And we all did that. And I would love to see the humanitarian, worker who hasn't been in a situation like this and swallowed it because this is the norm. So this doesn't work anymore. It shouldn't have worked and to start with, but it's starting to be recognized. So dissolve power, go protect people, allow them to speak. It's not an amoral position. It's not devoid of judgment. We still have to use our judgment and our morality and our understanding to enact it until we're not needed anymore.
Thank you, Tamam. That's great. Can I just move on now to Hassan's question, which is moving the subject on a little bit. How would you describe the humanitarian action for those who see it as a market business, considering the for-profit companies working in the humanitarian arena? Well, I suppose there is some echoes from what we've just been talking about, especially when it generates some negative community perspective. So how would you describe the humanitarian action for those where there's market business companies working in the area?
Oh, God.
Sorry.
Yes, please.
Zigwai, do you want to start and then come across to Tamam?
No, let's go to Tamam. Then
Okay, I
come back
apologize.
to me. Thank
Tamam.
you. I saw his hand before mine. Thank you.
I don't want. Okay, it is a business. There are people working in humanitarianism who call it a business. So let's not deny that and pretend it doesn't exist. I can live, in this world with us providing, with this being a business where the clients are people who are in need and who we are, flipping backwards to serve their desires and needs. The problem is the clients are the donors. What we're selling them is not health services, and we're selling them images of suffering people to get them to feel better about themselves. That kind of business is tough to swallow. And hence we write reports to donors, not to people we serve. And again, that's not a solution. I know that I sound ranty today, but this is, there are immediate things that do not require flipping the system on its head. That can be done. Stop writing reports for your donor, write reports for your beneficiaries. That would be a huge step. That would change the balance of power.
Thank you. Zigwai?
Thank you, Jerome. Just to say that I like Taman's response, and it's really cool to know that indeed it's a business. Over here, you get to see how certain people would even want to fan the embers of humanitarian crisis simply because they want to remain relevant. So it is important for us to also know that we need to identify the key players, the key victims, to shape their ideology. Because for so long as they have this this perspective that someone more superior is going to come and step in because we're having XYZ, then the solution, the problem is not going to end. And there are people that are strategically placed to keep fanning the embers of a humanitarian crisis. So we need to know carefully that as we do most of the things we're doing, we need to have the beneficiaries, for instance, have a say in the process. They need to draw up a sustainability plan for whichever humanitarian effort is being put to them, so that in the long run, they own the process, they drive it. But for so long as we take this standpoint that there is a particular person quite superior and the person is going to come and step in, then we would continue in this circle. So I think these are things that we can do to ensure that we address some of these issues. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Zigwai. And I will come to Cam now, because I think it sort of speaks to this kind of entrepreneurial, a different approach that BRAC perhaps has pioneered. So over to you on this question.
Thank you. Refugees, humanitarian, those who are in crisis are also people. And any people need market and enterprise to help them flourish. So I'm not talking about humanitarianism as an entrepreneurship. I'm saying entrepreneurs and corporations and the business sector should play a very important role in kind of transforming the camps into communities. The humanitarian camps into communities can only happen when they have a connection like everywhere else. Now, the problem is the clients, like or the participant of that market, that corporations are weak. So you need a supporter, you need a humanitarian agency doing the handholding and ensuring the rules of the games are fair for those in crisis, the refugees who can participate in the market fairly. And once again, I'm coming from a very pragmatic standpoint. I know ideally a lot of things should happen. Never happens, probably will not happen if there is no political dialogue and a political process when somebody is compelled to give up power in exchange of something else. That something else can be something that is more nuanced, more useful, and more win-win. Thank you.
Thank you, Cam. I'm aware, everybody, that time is moving on, but I would really like to address, like the panel to address this question that Marc Dubois has raised. And this might be our final question, but it's kind of looking at that whole issue of how we view humanitarian efforts in terms of a response to planetary health concerns. So he's saying we absolutely need the humanitarian system to take up the transversal issue of planetary health, but is there a risk that this transforms action on planetary health into a sticking plaster approach, displacing more uncomfortable approaches that change the causes? Apologies to Mark if I haven't got that absolutely right, but I'd be really interested to hear what the panel think. Are there risks, are there dangers in having such a lens? And if so, what might they be?
So Mark is a self-declared contrarian, and he's always has the right question to ask. And I see the risk absolutely. There is any tool, any approach can be used for good and for bad and can become redundant. So a critical view, I'll make a suggestion. A Brazilian educator more than 50 years ago, Paulo Freire, wrote about pedagogy for the oppressed. And it still survives today. Not many books remain relevant 50 or 60 years after their writing, acutely relevant. And a big part of what he talked about is the pedagogical process of the teacher and the student, of the educator and educated, being an equal and critical process. Planetary health covers problems we know today to be problems and that we have managed to create consensus about, and that's absolutely right. And the problems will evolve and we will have different understanding, and there needs to be a built-in implicit critical thinking, what Freire called conscientization, or creating of critical consciousness, that is not an afterthought, but part of the construction of this planetary health, of the way forward. It needs to think in mutual terms. It needs to do things that consciously understands that it can be instrumentalized. Of course, people who are working on it know that and are acutely conscious. Someone who works with Professor Jemilah in Sunway, Renzo Guento, was one of the first people who wrote about the coloniality of global health a couple of years back. So that exists. We have learning to do. And the learning is not only from humanitarian sources. The Black feminist movement, the Combahee River Collective, and the others who wrote about stuff like this, the there is plenty to learn from outside our. So being outward looking, finding teachers that will teach us, and keeping that critical consciousness going, self-criticism and not following the system might work, hopefully, if we're lucky.
Thank you, Taman. It helps us to frame that question and to answer that in that way. I think it tried to understand that question, and certainly Paulo Pereira's work resonating to this day is really crucial. As part of what you're saying is we should be conscious and aware of other critical voices and critical ideas in being self-conscious about our approach as humanitarian workers. I'm looking at the other questions. The last question that I can see that I'd like to put to everybody is a question from Stan Igio. And my question is to the panel is, at what point is it ideal humanitarian organization to intervene in conflicts? Should it be as mediators or mitigation strategists and using warning signals? And I guess that the example of the Syrian white helmets is a very interesting one there as well, in terms of the ethics of this and the perceptions of where people sit within conflict situations. So can I pose that question? Sigwa, you have your hand up there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jerome. I think I had my hand up in response to the planetary health issue. Yeah, but I can just talk and then go into the other question. So for me, I think we need to be deliberate about that. If we're not deliberate, these issues are going to continue. They're going to linger. As simple as keeping certain things away from the sea. Things that are not supposed to go into the sea. As simple as that, we need to be deliberate about it. We need to ensure that it is the water, for instance, does not become, because the water flows, does not become the body that takes away certain things because we do not want those things, forgetting that it will cause more damage in the long run. So we need to start making calls in terms of having people being deliberate about their attitude towards their environment, being deliberate about some of the key steps that would help us forestall some of these things in the long run. So the next question was about when is it ideal to intervene in conflict? I would say that it's very important to mitigate conflict. It's way easier mitigating conflict than managing it, because you never can tell how long it's going to last. And you never can tell how many lives are going to go down because of that. And you never can tell how many people will be eternally, like not internally, will be eternally displaced because of that. So these are things that we really need to deploy some early warnings and swing to action, you know, because these conflicts don't just erupt overnight. The humanitarian crisis we're experiencing did not erupt overnight. Now the conversation about Russia and Ukraine is building up. Day in, day out, we're seeing these blocks laid one on the other, one on the other. What are we going to do? Do we wait until it becomes a full-fledged humanitarian crisis where many lives are lost and people are displaced and people are battling with their health, people are battling with needs, shelter, food, water? Then we step in. Or do we have certain mechanisms? Can we deploy certain mechanisms, for instance, to say that there should be a set of very good mediators to go mediate between Ukraine and Russia? You know, how long are we going to wait until, how long are we going to be having reactive measures over proactive measures? So I think mitigation is the first step at every given time to avoid the humanitarian crisis, but we need to find actors that are willing and they're deliberate. And remember also that there's a tricky twist to this, that there's certain people that are benefiting when such conflicts are emanating. So they will consistently fan the embers of such conversations that will lead to humanitarian crisis. Over. Thank you, Jerome.
Thank you so much, because you're again, what's resonating is this idea that we must respond to crisis, but also it's easier to manage, to mitigate, and to try to think about how we prevent these situations, these conflicts, rather than respond to them, which I think was a point that was made earlier on. Taman, you had your hand up just for a second there. That's fine, absolutely. I can't see any further questions at the moment, so I hope we've covered everything. My colleague Claudia has extremely helpfully offered that if any questions haven't been addressed, if you have questions and you still have them, then please email them to Claudia. Her address, email address is in the chat box at the moment. Please use that, and she will be able to forward those questions on to our speakers so that you will get a response. Sigway, you have your hand up a second. I don't want to miss that. Is that an old hand or is that a new one?
Certainly an old one. Thank you.
Then it's my apologies to you for putting you on the
Thank
spot.
you, sorry.
I'm sorry. So I'd like now to draw this webinar to a close by, I guess, like, where do I start in terms of summary of remarks and thinking about that? Thank you so much, everybody, for your questions, for the audience. I think what we've heard, which is really that has been the point of this webinar, is to establish, to build, to encourage a dialogue, and that's what I think I've heard from all our speakers. We've heard about the importance of understanding the past and what has gone on, looking closely, examining the present, and then beginning to think about what the future of humanitarian efforts would look like. There've been some echoes of things like, how do you go about this? What would a dialogue look like? How do we access, engage in indigenous knowledge, in letting local? We heard from Dr. Jemilah and from K A M Morshed earlier on around how important it is that we start from the local and we start to understand that even though there are complications of how we access that information or what we do with that information, the importance of ownership has been applied. Rather than, as we've heard, creating another tyranny. We've heard the importance of dissolving power. Even these large international organizations, or even more nationally focused organizations, still have their level of power. It'll be about dissolving that power. And we can't dissolve that power until we kind of are conscious and transparent and appreciate our own positionality, where we are within the system and and it's being self-conscious but not being apologetic about that, and actually looking at the strengths and the challenges of that. And we've also heard, I think, through whatever route, that the role of the international humanitarian efforts should be about giving a voice to those who are in need, of those who are primarily affected. And however clients might be viewed as being weak or in need, they are also a voice that has a strength and will have a knowledge and an idea of how to resolve these issues. And often, as we've heard with some of the examples, have the capacities and the resources and the knowledge to overcome them. So I'm going to stop there and thank you very much, everybody, for your contributions to this, no doubt, ongoing dialogue and really critical dialogue. Thanks for all our speakers for giving up your time today. And also thanks to my colleagues, to Joe, to Janica, and to Claudia for, in particular, for arranging and putting this panel and this program together. I hope that all the audience have been stimulated and enjoyed, as I have, this discussion, and I look forward to having more discussions such as this in the future. With that, I'd like to draw the webinar to a close and wish you well in all your important work. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.